In this video, I want to look at managing your Studio One content installation and configuring your basic audio and MIDI hardware. Now, there's a new consolidated Studio One installation process available in Studio One 6, and we get to it from under the Studio One menu on top here. And if we go down to Studio One installation, we have a kind of revised, easier to work menu here where we can search and filter for the content that's available, and we have available updates there and installed content there and available downloads and so on. And it's simple a matter of clicking what you want or don't want, and you can filter here and then just click install from, select all, different install options and so on. And you can also alternatively install files directly from your My Presonus account page. Now, we also need to set up our audio hardware, and we can get to it directly from the start page, configure audio device, and this opens up the preferences window brought up with the tab for audio setup. I'm just going to close it just to show you that you can also get to it from under Studio One preferences, and we have these tabs over here. So first thing is to make sure that your audio device is recognized and selected, and you'll see a list of your available hardware connected to your studio. Now, if it's not appearing here, you'll need to go to the Audio MIDI Setup app in your Mac OS and make sure you have the proper drivers installed and that your actual operating system on the computer is recognizing it. So from here, it's a simple matter of choosing the device that you want to be using for playback, basically for output and input, and usually they're the same, but not necessarily. And here we have the device block size, and the general rule of thumb here is the lower you have this, the lower or less latency you're going to encounter. Latency meaning the time from when you, let's say, speak into your mic or play your guitar or hit your keyboard until you hear the sound back. So lower values are better for latency, but they're also more taxing on your computer. Higher values are less taxing, but you'll hear latency. So generally when you're recording and working, you want to have as low a latency as you can. And when you're mixing, you can increase it if necessary to get more power from your computer. We can set the sample rate here, and that's going to be based on your audio hardware for what's available. And you get a simple readout of the input latency and output latency generated by these buffer settings. And you can see if I increase this here, let's say 512, these numbers will go up. So I'm going to keep it at 128. I can even go down to 64, and it'll probably be fine where I get really imperceptible latency. Now here on the second page, we have audio dropout protection, which is kind of an advanced native low latency monitoring system. And with this, basically the tasks of audio playback and monitoring of audio inputs and virtual instruments are handled as separate processes. So it's a way of getting the least latency possible when you're using lower buffer sizes. It uses its own buffer for playback and processing of audio tracks, and we can change the settings here and it'll change this process size. And as this goes up, you'll see this little low latency icon here, meaning that low latency semonitoring for instruments is available, and you can turn it on or off here, and we can turn it on or off separately within the console, within Studio One songs, but that's a separate thing. Just for the basic setup, we set the dropout protection here, and again, the higher this goes, the greater the latency is, but you can also optionally enable the low latency mode to minimize that. And enabling plugin nap is another way to minimize the potential for audio dropouts. When audio isn't passing through an actual plugin, it reduces the resources that are needed. So it's good to leave that on by default, and you can selectively enable or disable it for individual plugins if you want to within Plugin Manager. So that's a basic audio setup. Now let's look at external devices. I happen to have a Novation Impulse keyboard connected, and that's what's being used. And I'm just going to remove it and show you how to create it from scratch. So I'm going to go add a new one, and you get a list of available devices. So look for your manufacturer and your device, and hopefully it'll be there. In my case, there's no category for Novation, so I have to create it from new. So I'm going to go new keyboard, and this is for when it's a MIDI keyboard controller and it's not an actual instrument that's generating sound. And device model, again, and manufacturer and name. So I'm going to just type in Novation and my device name. I'll call it that just so we can identify it. And here we can selectively enable or disable whatever MIDI channels we want used. And they're all on by default. You can turn them all off there and just select the ones you need. I'm going to leave them all on. Generally, I only use one channel, but in case I'm using some multi-timbral instruments and I want to access some other channels, I want to leave it on. And receive from, and here's where you choose the keyboard that's connected to your system. And again, if it's not appearing here, you'll need to go to the audio MIDI setup and make sure you have the proper drivers installed so that it's recognized by your system. So this is my Impulse keyboard, and there's also a MIDI input on it, and I'm not using that, so I want it to receive from that. And I can filter out any of these messages if I want, and mine actually leaks some pitch bend information. It's something I have to get repaired, but for now I'm going to filter that out just so we don't get distracted by random pitch bend. And send to, and in this case I want none because I want it to just trigger my software instruments, but we can actually route it here to other hardware if we want to. Enable split channels if you want to create separate instrument track inputs for each MIDI channel on your keyboard. I'm going to leave that off. And if you're working with multiple devices, you can enable one to be the default instrument input, so it's set up by default when you create new instruments. And there's also MIDI polyphonic expression that's now available. You can enable that if you're using an MPE-enabled keyboard, which the Novation Impulse isn't. And just to finish up with the start page, here you can optionally sign out or into your My Presonus account and Sphere. And here you can monitor transfers that are in progress when you're downloading content. This is for organizing macros, which is a more advanced feature we'll look at later in the series. And here you can manage your SoundCloud information for the SoundCloud section here. We'll continue with more in the next video.